Thank you very much, Mike, for inviting me to talk about the 26th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry today. One of my favorite regiments and all of the Civil War research that I've done. This is based on my book published by Savas Beatty on the Sigel Regiment several years ago. So if you happen to be interested, you can click on their website, and I'm sure they're still available. One of the primary influences on American history in the 19th century was immigration. Throughout the entire century, immigration continued, and not only continued, but increased. As you can see on this chart here, beginning in the first decade of the 19th century with 70,000 immigrants, it went up dramatically beginning in the 1830s to over 500,000, and then almost 2 million, and then well over 2 million by the time the Civil War occurs. 39% of these from 1820 to 1860 came from Ireland, and 31% came from Germany. Chief among the German immigrants were a group of ex-revolutionaries from the 1848 revolutions in the different German states, generally referred to in American history as the 48ers for obvious reasons. These included not only Germans, but Czechs, Hungarians, Poles, and others from Central and Eastern Europe who had participated in a lot of these revolutions, including the Italians as well for the Italian Revolution. Because they were more liberal in their views, most of these supported reform movements in the United States. And many of them were educated professionals. Some of them were quite well-to-do financially. So in one sense, they were not really your typical immigrant of that period. If we look at a map of Wisconsin here in 1860, you can see the dark green. Over 35% of the people in those particular counties were from Germany or had German heritage. The green that's not quite so dark, a quarter to over a third. So just looking at the map, you can see that Wisconsin was very heavily populated by people with German backgrounds or German ancestry. By 1860, 35.3% of the entire population of Milwaukee traced their roots to Germany. One of the leaders was Bernard Domschke. Most of these people, since they were leaders in the revolutions in Germany, tended to be rather liberal. They denounced slavery unequivocally, and they advocated free land for settlers, equal rights for African Americans and women, easier access to citizenship, and educational reform. And all of these goals were brought together in the Louisville Platform in 1854 in the hopes among German Americans that they could create a German political party to lobby for these liberal reforms that they wanted. One of the leaders of the German political movement in the United States was Carl Schurz, who at that time lived in Wisconsin also. During the 1860 campaign, he traveled over 21,000 miles, speaking in both German and English to audiences on behalf of Abraham Lincoln. His Doom of Slavery speech in St. Louis promised that if the Republicans were elected, slavery would be eliminated. And not only was this very popular, but it was reprinted in newspapers around the country and also in pamphlets and political pamphlets for use during the presidential election. Well, as we all know, Abraham Lincoln wins the election in 1860. And the result of that, or one of the results, is certainly the starting of the American Civil War. And by mid-1862, casualties rates had been higher than anything anyone had ever assumed they would be. So in August of 1862, Lincoln calls for 300,000 more volunteers. And here you see a copy of a recruiting poster in German, of course, circulated by the people organizing the 26th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry. Once the people got together and the regiment began to form, they took a vote and they named it in honor of Franz Sigel. So that becomes the Sigel Regiment. Franz Sigel was a leading German revolutionary in 1848 and a leader among the politically inclined Germans in the United States, probably the most famous political leader of that era of German extraction. So they name it the Sigel Regiment. The Colonel C goes to Wilhelm Jacobs from Braunschweig in Germany. He was president of the Second Ward Savings Bank. He was a tenor in the Sangerbund, the German Singing Society, and had just recently been elected clerk of the circuit court and county courts in Milwaukee. So he was a very prominent individual in the largest single ethnic group in Milwaukee. Who else was it that volunteered? I thought it might be interesting just to look at a half a dozen people and why they volunteered. I got a kick out of reading one historian wrote that with so many German immigrants, the federal government had to scour the country for German-speaking people to make them officers so they could find officers for all these regiments, which of course is completely ridiculous. All of these regiments were raised in local communities just like any other regiment, and the officers came from the local community either by election or by appointment. So, what were some of the motivations for people to join the Siegel Regiment? Well, we already mentioned Bernard Domschke. He was from Freiburg and one of the authors of the Louisville Platform. He was a radical newspaper editor who owned the Corsair. When news spread that they were going to be recruiting for a new German regiment, he closed his editorial office, marched everybody down to the recruiting office, and the entire editorial staff volunteered for duty in the 26th Wisconsin. Karl Dörflinger from Ettenheim, Germany, grew up in a farming family in Wisconsin, but he was an architect's apprentice when the call went out for more volunteers. He wrote that he was overcome by patriotic sentiment when he heard about this and he saw people rushing off to enlist. So he joined them and enlisted too out of patriotism and wanting to save the country and prevent it from being torn asunder. Karl Vickesberg was a carpenter in Herman, Wisconsin. He had just broken up with his girlfriend, or more truthfully, his girlfriend had just broken up with him. So, in a fit of what do I do and how do I get rid of this, and maybe if I get out of here, the memories will go away, he decided to enlist just to get out of the area. Albert Walber was born in Berlin. He was a clerk and a member of the Milwaukee Turnverein, the gymnastics association, German in Milwaukee. The Turnverein took a vote, and they voted that any adult male of military age who did not volunteer would immediately be expelled from the organization. So Walber and most of the rest of the organization marched down to the recruiting station and signed up for the 26th Wisconsin. We have Adam Bunsenberger from Hesse-Darmstadt. He was a cobbler in Greenfield, Wisconsin, secretary of the local German association, had 4 children, young children, and he enlisted, as he said in a letter to his wife, apologizing for leaving for the war. He said that he really wanted the bonus money that was being paid so he could donate it to the local Roman Catholic Church, which was in hard financial times. And finally, Franz Lochner. Lochner was a little bit different than the others, and he was actually born in Detroit, but came to Wisconsin with his family when he was very young. He was a law student when the war broke out and volunteered as a recruiting agent. He had, as he wrote in his memoir later, no intention whatsoever of ever signing up. What he was going to do was help recruit people for the 26th Wisconsin. But then as things went along and all of the other recruiting agents started signing up, he felt what we would call today peer pressure. And in a fit of this pressure, signed up for himself, and then wrote to his father saying that he regretted his decision, but since he had signed up, he had to go through with it. So Lochner was shall we say, a reluctant participant. Here's a picture of their colors, their initial national colors. On the left of the screen, you can see the color is relatively light. On the right, it's a little darker. What was left of the color is the part that's on the right in light color. The darker color, this was conserved at some point in the late 19th century, and what they did was they put a darker background on it and sewed it to that background. So the dark part on the right is really not part of what was existing at the time this was turned over. 26th Wisconsin was assigned to the 11th Army Corps, which had a number of German regiments, which is probably why it was assigned there. The commanding general of the 11th Corps at the time was Franz Sigel, so the members of the regiment could not be happier. The very person they named their regiment after turns out to be their commanding officer. They were assigned to a division led by Carl Schurz, a fellow Wisconsinite, and next to Siegel, probably the most prominent German in the United States at the time. And they were assigned to a brigade led by Colonel Władimir Krzyżanowski. Krzyżanowski was a Polish immigrant who had fought in the 1846 Polish uprising against Prussian control. So he was a fellow revolutionary and soon became known to the men enlisted in the 26th. Lincoln reviews the Army in April of 1863. The 26th Wisconsin was enrolled in the fall of 1863. I'm sorry, 1862. It entered the Army in time for Fredericksburg, but the 11th Corps was held in reserve there. So April of 1863 is really the first time that the unit takes the field in earnest. Frederick Winkler wrote, Father Abraham is notoriously not a handsome man, but there is that in his looks which says that he is not a common man. Joe Hooker was at this time the commander of the Army of the Potomac and had a reputation for being aggressive. Franz Sigel, as I mentioned, was commanding the 11th Corps, but Franz Sigel was not very happy. Up to this point, the Army was divided into grand divisions, which essentially two Army Corps were brought together to report to one person. When Hooker took over, he got rid of the grand divisions and everybody went back to Corps Command. And Siegel thought he deserved a bigger corps, or at least he deserved to have his corps brought up to strength. So he sent in a resignation, probably never thinking that it would be accepted, but it was, and he was replaced with Oliver Otis Howard from Maine. So the first campaign the 26th is going to take part in is the Chancellorsville campaign. You have the Union and Confederate armies facing themselves around Fredericksburg. And Joe Hooker's plan is to a wide flanking movement and come in behind the Confederates and try to squash Lee's army in between the two federal pincers. Hooker wrote, My plans are perfect. May God have mercy on General Lee, for I will have none. Talk about hubris. So beginning on the 27th of April, the plan begins to unfold. By the 28th, they reach Hartwick Church, the 5th, 11th, and 12th Corps, under Hooker's personal command. On the 29th of April, they cross the Rappahannock, and by the 30th of April, they reach the outskirts of this little town called Chancellorsville. Howard wrote, Here were trees all entangled in a thick, almost impenetrable undergrowth, and crisscrossed with an abundance of wild vines. In places, the forest appeared impassable. Lochner wrote in a letter home on May 1st that the day was splendid. So he went to the creek to wash. The boys cleaned their guns and were anxious for a chance to use them. Winkler wrote in a letter home that the 1st of May offered the first sunshine they'd seen in days, so it is to us almost a festive day. You have no idea how cheerful, how happy we feel. On the night of May 1 to 2, we have General Hooker's headquarters roughly here, the 3rd and 11th Corps drawn out here, the 5th and 12th Corps off to the right. And it's at this evening, the evening of May 1st, when Jackson and Lee meet and decide on a flanking movement to outflank Hooker's force. So beginning late in the evening, the Confederates march to Catherine's Furnace and then head south. And if you picture yourself, say, in the 3rd Corps, looking south, what you see is Confederate infantry moving and artillery moving across this open space by Catherine Furnace and then heading south into the trees. And of course, once they enter the trees, then they're lost from view. They get a little farther south and then they head west, and then they head northwest and then north to the Luckett Farm. And that puts them directly on the flank, the relatively exposed flank of the 11th Corps. Throughout the day, there were occasional reports of Confederates moving across the front of the Union position, so much so that General Schurz became concerned, and he asked for permission to face his division west to cover the exposed flank. Howard refused, saying there was no need to do that because everybody knew the Confederates were retreating. So on his own recognizance, um, Schurz takes the 82nd Ohio and faces it west, and his two reserve regiments, the 26th Wisconsin and 58th New York, and heads them west at the Hawkins Farm under the command of Colonel Krzyzanowski. So he does what he can to try and plug up this massive opening on the flank, but it's really too little too late at this point. About 5:30 p.m. on May 2, Jackson attacks with 33,000 men against roughly 9,500 men in the 11th Corps, and the Confederates are aligned roughly here. Winkler wrote, "The regiment had stacked its arms and the men were cooking their coffee. Bands played national airs, and nothing indicated that an enemy was near or foreboded the terrible storm that was approaching." Lieutenant Dorflinger was commanding a part of the picket line. He wrote that he was startled by the boom of a cannon and the new experience of the rattle of musketry to the southwest. Not knowing whether it came from our own or the Confederate forces, our excitement and suspense were intense. So the initial attack looked something like this. The Confederates attack. For a few minutes, they're held back by the three regiments holding the 11th Corps flank, but eventually the massive numbers simply allow the Confederates to outflank the Union position and come in behind it. So really the only choice they have at this point is simply to retreat along the plank road and get out of this encircling movement before they're completely encircled and forced to surrender. To the north, the pickets of the 26th Wisconsin are attacked and begin to withdraw back onto the regiment. Dorflinger wrote, "I started in double quick across the intervening space of about 75 yards. A bullet severed the strap of my leather pouch. Without halting, I continued in the tallest running match of my life. We then and there annihilated all our previous records for 75-yard runs." So this is what it looks like north near the Hawkins Farm. Iverson's brigade begins to attack but is driven back. But then when the rest of the Confederates come up in place, three entire brigades attack all at once against three Union regiments. And because of their overwhelming numbers, they're also able to come in on both flanks of the force that Colonel Krzyzanowski is leading. In order to escape, he orders a retreat, and they fall back to Hunting Creek. General Schurz at this time, now facing the blunt of the Confederate attack, rallies his troops near the Wilderness Church. Yeah. You can see the 26th Wisconsin is on the immediate right flank of the Union forces. And once again, they hold off the initial attack, but eventually numbers simply allow the Confederates to come around both flanks, and the Union forces begin to retreat, with the 26th Wisconsin bringing up the rear. As Dorflinger retires, a rifle ball shattered his left leg. He wrote, "The bullets passed me on all sides, rapidly weakening on account of a great loss of blood. I calmly awaited death. I counted 6 ranks of rebels passing over me, then lost consciousness." The army eventually withdraws back across the Rappahannock River to safety. One of the people who had observed the fight of the 26th Wisconsin, Colonel Underwood, in the 33rd Massachusetts, wrote, "The 26th Wisconsin stood in line 20 minutes, attacked by a largely superior number who had the advantage of a screening forest. They stood and fought unflinchingly until the enemy had largely doubled around their flanks, both right and left. They then retired in good order." Their division commander, General Schurz, wrote, "This young regiment, alone and unsupported, firmly held the ground where I had placed it for about 20 minutes, nor did it fall back until I ordered it to do so. There is hardly an officer who has not at least had a bullet through his clothes. Had it not been for the praiseworthy firmness of these men, The enemy would have obtained possession of the woods opposite without resistance, taken the rifle pits from the rear, and appeared on the plank road before the artillery could have been withdrawn. So the regiment, in its very first fight, gets considerable praise from the senior officers who observed it in action. It brought 471 men into action at Chancellorsville. 53 were killed, a percentage of about 11% killed in action. Aggregate casualties were 204, 43.3%, which was the fifth highest loss of all Union regiments that participated in the Chancellorsville campaign. Following Chancellorsville, of course, we have Gettysburg. The 11th Corps begins to cross the Potomac River into Maryland at Edwards Ferry on June 27th. By this time, the Confederates' Longstreet and Hill's Corps are well into Pennsylvania, and Ewell is closing in on Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, considerably farther north. So the march begins to catch up. And by the 30th of June, the 11th Corps is just south of the Pennsylvania line at Emmitsburg, Maryland. Sergeant Munzenberger wrote, "The weather is so hot that we think we can scarcely stand it, and yet we have to march with our entire equipment loaded like pack mules." The colonel had been wounded at Chancellorsville and was home recuperating, so the regiment now is led by Lieutenant Colonel Hans Beugel, who was a painter, an amateur actor, and a member of the Sangerbund, the Milwaukee German Singing Society. On July 1st, as the First Corps is being pushed very strongly and Confederates are beginning to arrive on its right flank, the 11th Corps arrives, and Howard sends two divisions north under Generals Schimmelpfennig and Barlow, and withholds Steinwehr's division on Cemetery Hill. About this time, Howard finds that Reynolds has been killed and he's the senior officer, so he turns over command of the 11th Corps to Carl Schurz. If we focus on the area north of Gettysburg, you see Krzyżanowski's brigade, the 26th Wisconsin, is in Krzyżanowski's brigade, initially in reserve. When Dole's and Gordon's Georgia brigades begin to attack, they're initially held back, but then the rest of the Confederate forces, the Louisiana and North Carolina brigades, outflank the Union right and force a retreat. Schurz orders Krzyżanowski forward to try and stem the retreat, but of course by this time it's way too late. As you can see on the map here, there simply are not enough Federals north of Gettysburg to face all of the Confederates that are raining down upon them. Krzyżanowski's brigade brought 1,425 men into action against over 4,300 Confederates. Carl Vickesburg wrote, "The bullets came thick as hail." And of course, being outflanked, they then had to retreat again. The 11th Corps rallied at the Adams County Almshouse complex, and once again were outflanked on both the right and the left by superior Confederate numbers and forced to retreat even farther. One of the Confederates in the 61st Georgia wrote, "The Yankees stopped and made a desperate stand. Their officers were cheering their men and behaving like heroes and commanders of the first order." Howard sends forward Coster's brigade to try and steady the retreat, along with Heckman's Battery K, 1st Ohio, and the 26th Wisconsin rallies behind the artillery to provide infantry support for Heckman's battery. Hayes arrives, attempts to attack, but is driven back, and then Avery's North Carolinians arrive, and as you can see, they outflank the Union position on the right once again, forcing it to retreat back through town. Vickesburg was shot through the hand during the retreat. He wrote later, "A woman saw my bloody hand. She called me into the house, washed my hand, and bandaged it." During the retreat through town, the regimental surgeon, Franz Heubschmann, was tending to casualties in a church when bullets started to come through the windows. So he walked out into the middle of the street with bullets flying all over the place. He had been the founder of the Wisconsin Banner, and actually had been a presidential elector in the Chicago convention that nominated Lincoln. He goes out into the middle of the street and waves his arms and yells at the top of his lungs, "Stop firing on the wounded and pick on healthy soldiers who can defend themselves." A local area resident, who unfortunately at this point is anonymous, wrote, "Few could forget the courageous Dutch doctor who, with his energetic interference, saved many lives." So the 26th Wisconsin falls back roughly to here, as the 11th Corps falls back to Cemetery Ridge and Cemetery Hill. During the next 2 days, Pickett's charge hits just off to their left. So aside from some brief skirmishing, they're not really involved in that. Off to the right, the attack on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill happens off to their right. So for the most part, for the next 2 days, they are engaged in skirmishing. But on July 1st, they marched 13 miles through heat, humidity, and a rainstorm to get to Gettysburg in time to help relieve the First Corps. They fought well in an impossible situation north of town. They rallied at the Almshouse line, supported Heckman's battery south of there, and then rallied again on Cemetery Hill. Carl Karsten wrote, "We have only fought 2 battles, but we have suffered terribly in both of them, so that our beautiful regiment has been decimated greatly." They brought 458 men into battle at Gettysburg. 61 were killed for a percentage of 13.3. Aggregate casualties 252. So the regiment lost 55% total casualties just at Gettysburg alone, which was the 15th highest loss of all Union regiments who participated in the battle. So clearly they were doing some fighting. Following Gettysburg, the Union Army is just south of Washington, D.C., and meanwhile, a Confederate army is besieging Chattanooga. So the War Department decides to send reinforcements from the Army of the Potomac out west to help relieve the siege. And they pick the 11th and 12th Corps and put them under the command of Joe Hooker. So they head west, first to D.C. and then west by train out to Indianapolis and then south through Kentucky and Tennessee to northwestern Georgia. Hans Boybel, the lieutenant colonel, had been wounded at Gettysburg and had his leg amputated. So command of the regiment now devolves on the new lieutenant colonel, recently promoted, Frederick Winkler. Winkler had been born in Bremen, Germany, and had been admitted to the Wisconsin bar just 2 years, almost exactly to the day that the Civil War begins. So here's Chattanooga, Confederate forces besieging it, the little red squares being pickets and cavalry and so forth. The 11th and 12th Corps arrive here, and then they begin to drive overland to relieve the siege. The 26th Wisconsin plays a minor part at the Battle of Wauhatchie, where it's largely in reserve, except for a few skirmishers. They then move north of Chattanooga, where the regiment was credited with skirmishing at Citico Creek, and then takes part in the assault on Missionary Ridge. From there, General Longstreet's forces were besieging Knoxville, Tennessee. So it's decided to send the 11th and 12th Corps north to break the siege of Knoxville. Winkler writes, "It was a fine agricultural country, but very much exhausted. It was difficult to get a cow, an ox, a few sheep or hogs from a farmer as we passed along, but we had to take them to subsist our column," obviously talking about getting farmers' animals along the way and foraging. They continued on, but just before they were ready to devolve on Knoxville, Longstreet hears of their arrival and decides that his force is too small to contend with the new arrivals. So Longstreet heads east toward Virginia. Winkler writes, "The hardships of the campaign had been extraordinary. The men were mostly without blankets, shoes were badly worn out, and quite a number were absolutely barefooted." So over the winter, after the Chattanooga, the relief of Chattanooga, the 11th and 12th Corps are combined into the new 20th Corps. And the 26th Wisconsin, of course, goes with them. So the 26th now becomes part of the 20th Corps and takes part in the General William Tecumseh Sherman's campaign against Atlanta. The 26th Wisconsin skirmished at Buzzard Roost Gap, where they captured some Confederate uh, uh, rifle pits. They skirmished again at Rocky Face Ridge and again captured some Confederate rifle pits. And they eventually end up at Resaca, Georgia, where they were part of a brigade level attack that captured Confederate rifle pits and an entire battery of artillery. Frederick Buerstadt wrote after the battle, "The road is scattered full of dead horses, pieces of clothing, weapons, cartridge containers, etc. Dead and wounded lie everywhere." From there, they move on to Cassville, and Buerstadt writes in a letter home, "We are finding while marching many dead and wounded left behind by the enemy." They next skirmish with Confederates at Burnt Hickory, and then at Dallas, where they captured a series of entrenchments from the Confederates in an attack. Of the attack, Winkler wrote, "We attacked quite fiercely and fought a sharp battle which lasted until night, when we held all of the ground we had gained." From there, they go on to New Hope Church, and marching away from that skirmish, we came upon several chickens which were transported into the other world. So obviously, they're still looking for food along the way as well. They then skirmish at Pine Mountain and Golgotha Church. Winkler wrote about the latter battle that he was subjected to the sharpest artillery fire since Gettysburg. The noise of whizzing and exploding shells is terrific. And then they skirmish again at Lost Mountain. Along about this time, they receive a new set of colors from Wisconsin, the old ones being pretty dilapidated and barely holding together, as you saw earlier in this presentation. So the new colors, they get a slightly different scheme for the stars in the field, the blue field, but the colors have their name imprinted on it, 26 Wisconsin Infantry, and the major battles they had been up to that time, Chancellorsville, Gettysburg, Wauhashie, and Missionary Ridge. Next, they skirmish at Muddy Creek, and at some point during the action, one of the captains decides that his men are taking too much fire, so he orders, pretty much on his own, an attack across open ground into the Confederate works. When Company B attacks, then the rest of the companies assume there's an order for an advance, so everybody advances, and they end up capturing not only the Confederate position, but also the enemy colors. Next, they skirmish at Noses Creek, and then Kennesaw Mountain, where they're held pretty much in reserve. And at Kolb's Farm, where again they lead an attack which captures a line of Confederate entrenchments. And that brings them to Peachtree Creek on the outskirts of Atlanta itself. The Union line roughly here, Confederate line roughly here. The Confederate plan of attack was to attack the Union left and drive it in, and then try to roll up the line, which would be off to your left on the screen. Buerstadt wrote, "The gunfire exceeded anything I had ever heard before. We loaded and fired as fast as possible." The regiment, or the brigade rather, off to the left, to your right, of Wood's brigade is driven back, and part of Featherston's brigade, the 33rd Massachusetts, begins to outflank Wood's brigade, at which point the 26th Wisconsin is in reserve, so Wood shifts them off to his left, to your right, and Colonel Winkler writes, "For a time the conflict was desperate. I took every man who could be spared on the right to reinforce the left. The 26th Wisconsin held. The Union line was not turned, and Peachtree Creek turned into a Union victory. The brigade commander, Colonel Wood, wrote, coolly and deliberately the men poured into their rebel line a well-directed, withering, and destructive fire, which covered the ground with dead and wounded. To us, it was a brilliant feat of arms. The following day, Frederick Buellerstedt wrote, this morning our regiment, after a sleepless night, had to bury the dead Rebs which laid before our regiment. They were all from the 33rd Mississippi Regiment. Our regiment lost 9 dead and 36 wounded. We buried over 50 Rebs, among them Colonel Drake and most of the officers of the 33rd Mississippi. During the conflict, Captain John Fuchs of Company A captured the Confederate colors of the 33rd Mississippi, and here you can see a picture of them in the Historical Society in Wisconsin. And you'll notice here it says captured by the 26th Regiment Wisconsin Volunteers at Peachtree Creek, Georgia, July 20th, 1864. Colonel Wood, the brigade commander, wrote, I cannot discharge my whole duty in this report without pointing out for a special commendation the conduct of the 26th Wisconsin Volunteer Infantry and its brave and able commander. The position of this regiment in the line was such that the brunt of the attack fell upon it. The brave, skillful, and determined manner in which it met this attack, rolled back the onset, pressed forward in a countercharge, and drove back the enemy, could not be excelled by the troops in this or any other army, and it is worthy of the highest commendation and praise. And it's hoped that it'll set an example for others. Now, this is an interesting painting. This was done by a veteran of the 26th Wisconsin, and it shows here in the foreground the 26th Wisconsin marching forward to take part in the fight at Peachtree Creek. It also served as the cover for my book. The Sigel Regiment was one of the first regiments to enter Atlanta when the city fell to Sherman's attackers. After a brief rest, the Sigel Regiment takes part in Sherman's March to the Sea in October and December of 1864. From Atlanta, they moved to Sheffield, destroying or helping to destroy along the way the Georgia Railroad. From there, they occupied Milledgeville, which at that time was the Georgia state capital. Buellerstedt wrote, we began to live from that which we found on plantations, such as potatoes, pigs, chickens, sheep, and so forth. Continuing east, they destroyed the Georgia Central Railroad near Davisboro, and then the Augusta and Savannah Railroad east of Louisville, and eventually made their way to Savannah. Savannah, of course, was occupied by the Confederates. At one point, it was determined that it would have to be taken by assault. So in the first line of the assaulting column, the 26th Wisconsin formed regiment, 2 lines deep, ready to make the assault. And just minutes before the bugle was sounded to drive the men forward, it was announced that it had been discovered the Confederates had retreated and that there was no need for the attack. So they were saved, at least on that particular day, by a few minutes. The Confederates retreated, leaving Savannah and Fort Pulaski to the Union forces. From Savannah, the 26th marched north. It was present at the burning of Savannah, of Columbia, South Carolina. I did not take part in it, but it was present outside, and several of the soldiers commented on seeing flames from the city in their letters back home. From there, it participated in the Battle of Aversboro, North Carolina. Winkler writing that it was a hot skirmish ensued. The regiment advanced and took a line of breastworks. Now, from there, it took part in the Battle of Bentonville. When Confederates attempted to outflank the Union, the regiment came up from a position in reserve, held the line, and drove it back. and then continued march north until April 26th, when it was in the vicinity of the Bennett House when General Joe Johnston surrendered to Sherman. From there, the regiment marched north, arriving in Washington, D.C. in time to take part in the Grand Review of troops on May 24th, 1865. And here you see, I don't know what regiment this is, but here you see a portion of the Grand Review on that day. And its battle honors. I think if you look at this list, you will say that it indeed deserved whatever adulation was given to it. Not too many Union regiments were involved in so many battles and skirmishes throughout the war. General Cogswell, the brigade commander in which the 26th Wisconsin served during the campaign in the Carolinas, wrote that it was one of the finest military organizations in the service. Edwin Bryant of the Military Order of the Loyal Legion wrote that in the roll of honor of Wisconsin's regiments, none are more deserving, none have a more glorious record than this regiment. And William Fox, in his famous regimental losses in the American Civil War, wrote that the 26th was a German regiment whose gallantry and soldierly bearing reflected credit upon its nationality. If you look at Wisconsin fatalities, roughly 1 out of every 7 soldiers from Wisconsin who signed up to serve in the Civil War became a fatality. In the Sigel Regiment, it was 1 out of every 4. Total casualties were 617, which was 56.7%. But toward the end of the war, in April and May of 1865, after Lee's surrender, there were several new recruits, an entire company of new recruits who joined the regiment. And there were also dozens of soldiers from other units who were being disbanded, whose service had not expired, so they were transferred to the 26th. If you eliminate the people who actually joined the 26th Wisconsin after Lee's surrender, then the real percentage of casualties of those who served during combat with the regiment was 63%, an enormously high percentage. Killed or died of wounds, 189, for a percentage of 17.2. You know, as editor of Gettysburg Magazine, I think I got more submissions about the Iron Brigade for possible publication than any other unit. Either the brigade itself or its commanding officer or one of the units in it. The Iron Brigade, and rightly so, has been pointed to as a really exceptional group of soldiers during the Civil War. The percentage of killed and died of wounds among the regiments that made up the Iron Brigade was approximately 15%. In the 26th Wisconsin, it was 17.2%. And I had to laugh. I read one book about Gettysburg in which the author was talking about the Iron Brigade and how tough it was and how high their percentages was. And he used as an example, he said, for example, the 26th Wisconsin, and went on to talk about them. Of course, the 26th Wisconsin was never in the Iron Brigade. William Fox in regimental losses in the American Civil War. You can see here in the red, I've highlighted the 26th Wisconsin. Fox found that of all the thousands of regiments that served in the Union armies during the Civil War, the 26th Wisconsin had the 5th highest percentage of killed or died of wounds in the entire Union Army during the entire war. Now, that's quite a record. Here's a photograph of veterans from the 26th Wisconsin at the dedication of their monument at Gettysburg in 1888. And a 50th reunion that was held outside of Milwaukee in 1912. You can see how old a lot of these people look, and clearly there are wives and some younger people who are probably sons mixed in with the group as well. But what happened to our volunteers that we mentioned at the beginning? Well, let's take a look. Franz Lochner. Lochner was the recruiting agent who really didn't want to go and told his father later he was sorry he signed up, but it was his duty. He survived the war, became the president of the National Turnverein Association, and after moving to Chicago, became the president of the Chicago Bar Association. Karl Dorflinger, who signed up because of patriotic sentiment and had his ankle shattered at Chancellorsville, underwent 5 additional operations over the next 15 years to try and fix his leg. He eventually was elected to the Board of Regents of the Wisconsin University System and founded, of all things, the Dorflinger Artificial Limb Company. Bernard Domsky. Domsky was the editor of the Corsar who marched his entire editorial staff down to enlist. Domsky was captured at Gettysburg, and later, after the war, he survived. After the war, he published in 1865 a book on his prison experiences, which is really quite outstanding and has been used by a number of historians in dealing with Confederate prisons and so forth. Unfortunately, he died in 1869 at the age of 43 from the lingering effects of his imprisonment. Albert Walber. Walber was one of the people from the Turnverein who went down and enlisted when the Turnverein threatened to expel anybody who didn't. Walber was also captured at Gettysburg and sent to Libby Prison in Richmond, and was one of a group who actually managed to escape from Libby Prison in 1864 and make it safely back to federal lines. In the post-war years, he became vice president of a manufacturing company in Milwaukee. Carl Vickesburg, who enlisted because of a lost love affair, was shot through the breast at Resaca, Georgia, and died the following morning. And Adam Munzenberger, who enlisted to use the bonus money to bail out his failing Blessed Sacrament Church, was also captured at Gettysburg and sent to Belle Prison in Richmond, where he succumbed to disease in December 1863 without ever having seen his 4 children again. So I thank you for your patience, and I hope not only that I was able to perhaps give you some idea of what the 26th Wisconsin accomplished during the war, but also an insight into the people who were in it and why they enlisted and what happened to them, and to give the face of at least one regiment a human face for all of you. So thank you very much.